joining us for what I think is going to be a very important and interesting discussion.
I'm Franca Palazzo, Executive Director of the Canadian Internet Society. It's great to see so many of you here today, familiar faces, some new faces, joining us for what I think is going to be a very important and interesting discussion. I'm Franca Palazzo, Executive Director of the Canadian Internet Society. It's great to see so
The aim is to create a roadmap for Canada's digital policy that is both forward-looking and responsive to the needs of Canadians. This isn't just a one-off conversation. It's part of a sustained effort to ensure Canada can keep pace with rapid technological change while addressing the gaps and challenges that have held us back. Back in June, we started with the Canadian Internet Society's first Digital Policy Forum, where we brought together a diverse group of expert voices from across Canada to unpack the current state of digital policy, or lack thereof, in Canada. The insights from that forum were clear. We have a lot of work to do, and that's why we're here. To build on these conversations, refine our ideas, and start moving towards solutions. I'm going to give you a quick snapshot of what we found in our first forum. We came up with 5 areas that we think need looking at. Governance. Our digital policy is fragmented, and that's putting it lightly. We need a whole of government approach, or even a dedicated ministry, to provide structure, transparency, and accountability that this space requires. Second, stakeholder engagement. Policy can't be made in a vacuum. We need to bring in voices from civil society, technical experts, and communities that are often overlooked. A multi-stakeholder approach is key to making policies that work for everyone. Third, policy coherence. We've got to stop treating digital policy as something separate from everything else. It's not. Digital touches infrastructure, the economy, social equity, everything. We need to think holistically and integrate digital policy into broader national priorities. Foresight and adaptability. Technology moves fast, and if we don't start planning for what's coming, AI, data governance, etc., we'll always be playing catch up. Proactive planning and investment in research will be critical. And lastly, international cooperation. Canada has an opportunity and frankly a responsibility to lead on the global stage. Issues like digital sovereignty and data protection don't end at our borders. We need to be part of shaping international frameworks. So these are the themes that emerged from our first forum, and I think you'll hear echoes of them throughout today. Our incredible panelists and speakers will explore these issues from multiple perspectives, drawing on their expertise to help us better understand the opportunities and challenges ahead. The insights they share today will play a critical role in shaping the recommendations that will inform our final report, a report that we hope will serve as a valuable resource for the next government as it charts Canada's digital future. So, thank you again for being here, and we'll get started. Our first session, laying the groundwork, defining Canada's digital policy. This session is going to define the current state of Canada's digital policy, highlighting gaps and opportunities for improvement. And in order to do that, I'm going to call up Tim Denton, Chair of the Canadian Internet Society, and Philip Palmer, Vice President of the Canadian Internet Society.
Thank you, Franca. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to reconnect with a former girlfriend of mine. And we had lunch together. We talked about old times. We talked about our new families and jobs and careers, et cetera, et cetera. And it was very pleasant. About 3 or 4 months later, I ran into my ex-girlfriend's sister. And her sister said to me, "Oh, yes, you had lunch with Anne, as it happened?" I said, yeah, what did she have to say about that? "Oh," she said, "you're still short." So I am short, and I intend to be brief. So as Franca outlined, the Policy Forum in June and this event are not the end, but rather the beginning of a process. The Canadian Internet Society is resolved to build on these experiences to create forums that bring together knowledge and expertise to offer government advice on how to tackle the challenges posed by the internet and the knowledge economy that will confront any government of any political stripe. In the few minutes available to me, I would like to address 2 issues that contribute to the failure of government to come to grips with the internet and the knowledge economy. There are dozens of topics that are issues that I could single out, but I think that there are 2 that have posed particular obstacles to government policy over the last few years and posed frustration for those of us who have attempted to understand or to help shape government policy. The first is the culture of secrecy, and the second is legislative gamesmanship. It's more than 40 years since the Access to Information Act came into effect. Over the years, the response times to access requests have lengthened, while an oversensitive bureaucracy has learned ever more adeptly to apply exemptions to prevent Canadians from learning what government knows and what government is doing. I happen to know about this because as a lawyer in the government, I contributed my learning and skills to that exercise. In parallel, the information environment in which we live has changed. So for instance, you look at the National Press Gallery in Parliament, and it is diminished. It's decimated, in fact. So there are fewer people, professionals, able to watch for us. So for us to be able to, in fact, respond to government, contribute to government, contribute to our own governance, that gap has to be filled. And at the moment, there's a serious gap between what Canadians can know and what they must know. In short, the culture of secrecy leads to a lack of accountability, both on the part of bureaucrats and of politicians, particularly ministers. Prime example of that, of course, is the ArriveCAN app. The Auditor General, with all of his or her powers, can't determine what happened, what it cost, who made the decisions, and also it's clear that somebody is lying to Parliament. These are grievous sins in any democratic order, but that culture of secrecy is impairing the ability of Canadians to hold the government to account. We also have this broad document of Privy Council secrecy that prevents even such routine matters as submissions to the Treasury Board from being public. Why? Because they're secrets of the Queen's Privy Council for Canada. Sorry, King's Privy Council. Draft legislation is considered to be a secret of the Queen's Privy Council. And this hobbles the ability of departments to, in fact, modify legislation in the drafting courts, to consult with experts, consult with interest groups, to ensure that the legislation that everybody wants is, in fact, in a position to be able to be adopted by Parliament. The deliberations of administrative tribunals are subject to deliberative secrecy. We don't know how the CRTC is making its decisions. There is no culture of dissent. There is no culture of accountability for the individual contributions to those decisions. I'm sorry. Okay. Justice opinions. So the Department of Justice is the legal advisor to government. We understand the need in particular cases for the need for solicitor-client privilege, but really, should it apply to things like the constitutionality of legislation? Shouldn't that be something that is exposed to the public, open to debate, and permit an engagement on the basis of the legislative power that's being exercised? And lastly, as a result of the decline in public news organizations, lobbyists have much more access to information than do news organizations and do citizens. The impact of this leads to distrust of government, disregard for expertise, and of course, where there are information gaps and knowledge gaps, the vacuum is filled with misinformation and disinformation. Second area I'd like to concentrate on is legislative gamesmanship. And that really consists of marrying privacy legislation with artificial so the examples are marrying the privacy legislation with artificial intelligence legislation to have no commonality. Marrying the online harms legislation with hate speech in the criminal code. Yes, there are relations between the two, but one is a complete code and needs to be examined in its particular depth, for its particular characteristics and its impact. And they're very different from the impact of having the Canadian Human Rights Commission look at various forms of hate speech and the criminal code imposing penalties up to life imprisonment for certain offenses. This gamesmanship has both stalled incredibly important legislation for Canadians. It's prevented parliamentary committees from being able to properly study the legislation as such. And it's, of course, frustrated those who are seeking to make submissions to parliamentary committees because there's only so much time, so much expertise that can be brought to bear. It distracts from focused scrutiny. And it holds necessary legislation hostage to unpopular or underdeveloped legislation. Thank you very much. Those are my comments.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. It's going to be an interesting afternoon, I hope. I have got sort of like 7 minutes in which to explain the entire history of the internet, which I will not do, and interest you in the policy issues that are before us. If you listen to Peter Thiel, we're stagnating. Generally speaking, the progress of the early 20th century has stopped, and we are spending a lot of time not going forward. If you listen to Eric Schmidt, we're doing fine on both the atom side and the signal side. Now, Thiel will admit that in the terms of computer communications, we have made enormous, fast, rapid, transformative progress. So, we make that progress because, first, the laws of physics allow it. The laws of physics do not allow flying cars at any great level, but they do allow for faster signal processing. And secondly, out of the genius of DARPA, or whatever it was, the Internet Protocol was invented. Now, it's extremely important to realize that the Internet Protocol is an engineering standard. It's not a law. The law is not obliged to pay any attention to it. The law is, in fact, frequently ignores it. But out of the creation of the Internet Protocol, the Red Sea of things that parted, and on one side we had transport, and the other side we had applications. And applications didn't exist before the TCP/IP protocol was invented. So we have this division of the waters between transport, which costs billions, and applications, which costs millions. And the entry into the applications, well, there's plenty of them. They're growing every day, and it's a zone of fertile experimentation and new markets and new avenues and new ways of doing things. All this is perfectly obvious. But it's important to remember that the internet is only an engineering standard and that laws are not obliged to pay any attention to it. A particular example, which recently comes to mind, is our redoing of the Broadcasting Act, which had the effect of stamping each and every part of the current situation with the old model of the Broadcasting Act. And what I mean by that is, simply speaking, a society can innovate by allowing innovation, or a society can stifle innovation by the carrying forward of obsolete forms of thinking. Now, obsolete forms of thinking are carried forward because people have an economic interest in doing so. And the balance between whether we're going to have innovation or stagnation is very frequently a very political and messy decision, a messy situation. And we hope that the example of the difficulties that the Online Streaming Act has gotten itself into will be an example of what not to follow, to stop trying to stamp the future with the assumptions of the past. And we hope that some learning will occur. So there's many, many areas in which the Internet Society can play. Some battles we've won, some we've lost, some we will hope to win again. But it's important that if a society is to innovate, minds must be open to innovation. It's not just the laws of physics that determine the outcome. It's also whether the society can tolerate new ways of thinking, new ways of doing it, new social classes, new ways of getting things done. And we, on the Internet Society, are very much in favor of the possibilities of innovation. We are concerned with what the innovation may take us, but we're mostly very concerned about the apparent inability to accept the degrees of changes that are being required of us in our decision makers. And our institutional arrangements are in many cases out of touch with where we need to go. So this afternoon, I hope we will have an interesting and broad-ranging discussion of a bunch of things where the possibilities of innovation are celebrated and responsible reactions to these innovations are contemplated. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Tim and Philip. Now I'd like to introduce Mark Schaan, Deputy Secretary to the Cabinet, Artificial Intelligence with the Privy Council Office of Canada, and Hannah Daly, Editor at the Wire Report. I'll have you both come up. And there's going to be a keynote and then a fireside chat on the state of digital policy in Canada.
Bonsoir à tous, and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here, and thanks so much for the provocative and interesting introductions to today's assembly. My name is Mark Schaan. I'm the Deputy Secretary to the Cabinet for Artificial Intelligence at the Privy Council Office, and it's my pleasure to join you here today. And we just want to start by acknowledging that we're here in the National Capital Region on the unceded traditional territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples who have presided over this place for time immemorial. An important reminder, I think, in part because as we talk about the future, sometimes it's a good reminder of both the relationship back to often marginalized traditional peoples, but also the import of thinking with a multi-generational approach to kind of topics like the digital society. I think we've got a bit of a challenging conversation to think about how to kind of frame digital policy for the way forward, which can be as expansive probably as we'd like it. My current role, I find expansive enough, and it only tries to capture artificial intelligence, as opposed to all of the digital kind of tools and toolkits that we find ourselves within. The Secretariat at the PCO has essentially been established to try and seize Canada's opportunity, and so we're keen to understand some of the thinking that will come out of this effort from the Internet Society about what a forward-looking digital policy can look like. Maybe a couple of points that I would just make before I get to have a good conversation with Hannah, and I'd offer a few thoughts. One is, I think this multi-tentacled kind of feature of digital policy is that it is in fact kind of everything. And so I think when thinking about how to draft and craft digital policy, one has to identify that you are ultimately going to have to be prioritizing and working across multiple policy objectives. And those policy objectives in and of themselves are not necessarily wrong or bad. And in fact, actually, when they are cross purposes is often an important element for governments to think reflectively and thoughtfully about how to entertain them. I think about that in the context of my public service career, where I think it's useful to identify and note and even just name when public policy interests are multiple in nature, as opposed to pretending or trying to gloss over digital policy contradictions or tensions that are inherent to the work that we do. It's very natural, for instance, in my old job at Industry Canada, when I was still Industry Canada, that as Director of Life Sciences, my goal was to grow life sciences and bioeconomy. And that was sometimes in tension or at odds with my colleagues at Health Canada, whose job was to create a safe and effective drug supply for the people of Canada. Those two public policy objectives aren't inherently wrong, they're both valid, but figuring out how to actually work through some of those tensions, I think, are some of what is often the most important piece. And I think that's exactly where we find ourselves at the digital policy table, which is to say that there are multiple streams and multiple kind of active efforts at play and multiple interests that need to be satisfied and understood. Whether that's the distinction between content providers and content creators, whether that's the distinction between the necessities for safety and security and the desire for open and for transparency. And I think those are often elements where we really need to kind of sort things through. When I think about the effort that got us to the Digital Charter, which was a previous attempt at trying to outline what a vision for an internet and data-fueled economy and society could look like, one can see that it transcends multiple players and actors. It has everything from access to the tools and skills to be able to engage with connectivity and with an internet and data-driven society and economy, all the way through to fair and free elections and devoid of interference from foreign actors. And I think that's just a portion of the kind of continuum that exists across the digital economy that needs to get wrestled with. And then I think we have to structurally and methodically think about the tool sets and the kind of foundations that help us underpin what good digital policy looks like. And so we have an approach in Canada that I think we have to recognize as the kind of founding context within which we find ourselves. We're blessed or potentially cursed, depending on how you think about it, with a set of marketplace frameworks that are of general application and cut across the entirety of the economy. They include things like competition, like copyright, like intellectual property, and like privacy. And those marketplace frameworks have a capacity to be updated for a digital economy and for an increasingly connected and data-driven and AI-driven and algorithmically informed and augmented economy and society. But then there are sector-specific or activity-based regulations that live on top of those, whether that's the management and regulation of cars or the management and regulation of health. And those have an important role to play in terms of the degree to which they are doing the work of keeping us both benefiting from, but also safe in a world of connectivity and increased proliferation of data. Then there are certifications, standards, codes, and protocols, data trusts, a whole series of voluntary efforts that can essentially live on top of or in place of activity-based or sector-specific regulations. And then there are trade rules and norms that often live even on top of that. And I think we have to recognize that that continuum of tools is the shape with which we can inform a modern approach to data and digital policy. Not recognizing the interplay between them or suggesting that we can somehow do away with those, I think, is problematic at outset. And I think we have to recognize the degree to which those various elements can and should be enacted upon and grown. So I think that is the task ahead of us, and I think AI is a principal kind of driver. It's one of the reasons why the Secretariat was created, and I think is hopefully informative as to the ways in which we can think about the cross-cutting and by its very nature, friction-filled and tense-full approach to digital policy in a modern era. So with that, I'll take some questions.
All right. So, like was said, my name is Hannah Daly, and I'm with the Wire Report. So you mentioned a lot of words and a lot of ways that things overlapped. I liked the use of multi-tentacled. So thinking of that and this ever-changing digital space that we're in, looking at policy and looking at what has to change, do you think Canada's more proactive or reactive right now?
That's a good question. I think there are ways in which our digital policies are ideally forward-thinking, and I think there are definitely some elements of our digital policy that have been a culture of our zeitgeist. And so, and I think this is some of the challenge of doing effective policymaking in a digital era is that where there is a void that's created within the polity, when you've got kind of citizen issues that are kind of surfacing, I think they latch onto and seek the easiest path to remedy. And sometimes that's a challenging space because either things are in midstream or there isn't necessarily a legislative or regulatory kind of fix. And so, interestingly, I think I would use the origin story for the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act as one of the kind of realities of how these sorts of issues come to surface, which was, everyone probably will remember that we had a first attempt at privacy modernization in the earlier mandates of this government. That focused solely on modernizing the Personal Information and Protection of Electronic Documents Act. But when the new minister arrived and began very quickly pushing on issues that were very top of mind for citizens and the society around things like algorithmic harms and increasing amounts of potential for AI to be potentially pushing on citizens in ways that were unhelpful, but not necessarily tied to personal information, it necessitated some sort of response that sort of said, well, if not PIPEDA, then what? And that very much gave rise to the possibility of a need for the government to have some mechanism to be able to regulate high-impact AI systems, and that was that was the relationship both to the bill and then ultimately to the effort. And so I think you can see those types of issues in a number of spaces where sometimes the moment creeps up on you faster than what our either toolkit or our current approaches allow for, and it will seek an exhaust valve that is wherever the steam can get to quickest in some ways. And so I think we probably suffer from both, an attempt to be as proactive as possible, sometimes allowing perfect to be the enemy of the good, and then sometimes just falling to the notion of needing to be reactive to what are critical issues in the polity.
Mm-hmm. And looking at Canada's digital policy, as far as priorities go, you mentioned AI as a principal driver. So where does AI, in your opinion, fit in shaping those priorities?
So AI is an interesting kind of telltale or kind of case example in some ways of some of the both challenges and opportunities of digital policymaking in Canada. It's a technology for which Canada has played an outsized role in its development. So, 41 years ago, the Canadian Institutes for Advanced Research started their neural network and machine learning program, which at the time saw zero pathway towards kind of enlightenment and the notion of the degree to which this would actually be a technology that Canada would actually drive. And so I think that's telling in a lot of ways. One is that good policy and good effective outcomes in the digital space are not always assured, and nor is there a linear relationship between now and where you need to get to. On the other hand, notwithstanding the fact that we boast the Nobel Prize winner who helped shape this technology, a computer scientist who won a physics award, we have the lowest levels of trust in artificial intelligence amongst our G7 peers. Shockingly low degrees of willingness on the part of average Canadians to engage with the technology and feel safe in its usage. And so I think AI is a telltale of the kinds of both costs and opportunities for Canada in specific. On the one hand, we need to get to trust. On the other hand, we absolutely also need to seize our opportunity to be able to be the drivers of the application and adoption of a technology that I think we can credibly say we played an important role in developing. And so I think AI fits into a broader digital suite that needs to find that important balance where it absolutely promotes innovation, absolutely uses technology for the good of the social problems and the economic problems that we find ourselves within, including a monstrous productivity gap, but also at the same time brings people along, because it's not assured that you necessarily will find yourself with a willing public desirous to be able to engage or adopt.
And circling back to the policy aspect of that once again, what kind of steps could Canadian policymakers take to kind of foster a more proactive or even adaptable digital policy framework, or are there steps at this point?
Yeah, so I think we're thinking about this in a few ways. So one is, you can easily find yourself in a never-ending spin cycle where you have no good use cases, which fuels a lack of trust or a lack of kind of insight into the possibilities and the opportunities of the technology, which fuels risk aversion and an unwillingness, therefore, to adopt. And you can literally kind of continue in this zone where no one wants to adopt good use cases because there's risk aversion and fear that you'll be negated by the public opinion around it. And so I think we need better use cases, and I think we need to bring people along in ways that actually sort of make sense. And so we're thinking about this methodically within the context of AI adoption, both in the public service and in the broader economy, by trying to find those opportunities where we actually think that implementation at scale is both useful, not necessarily obvious, but certainly can create obvious benefits in the short term, and that actually can drive the productivity and efficiency gains that we think are actually what will ultimately sell business process owners around meaningful adoption. And we have to do the exact same thing with the private sector in terms of ensuring that there's both Canadian capabilities at the ready and a prod and a willingness to be able to allow for that risk aversion to be overcome. And so I think we have to think about that both at the level of kind of back office, but also at the level of signature capabilities, where I think Canada is well placed to be able to fuel some of that, particularly in our current geopolitical context.
And in trying to engage more with a perhaps untrusting public, as well as with industry, is there a way to make that process more understandable and transparent for people to try and get them on board?
Yes and no. So, people make lots of analogies between the digital world and the analog world and how we got to good outcomes in the analog world. And there's been some fascinating research and writing done on particularly international governance and the digital reality, and thinking through how can we look at previous models that got to reasonable or at least consistent international governance and think about what that means for the current state of things. And so people point to things like the Financial Action Task Force at the OECD, or they point to things like ACAHO in aviation and think about mechanisms by which we can think about some of those. I think the civil aviation kind of analogy is an interesting one, because I'm not sure that kind of getting to doubting Thomases by putting fingers in holes is necessarily the easiest mechanism, and that's certainly not what happened in civil aviation. None of us, last time I checked, did a double take on the plane that we got onto to make sure that the screws were in the right spots and that we actually thought that we were going to be able to fly safely. We took for granted that the right standards and other efforts were in place, and we saw enough planes fly and land safely that we all decided that it was worth it to get on it. And so I think we have to find a kind of similar kind of middle ground that allows us in the digital space to both have seen enough planes take off and land effectively and enough effective standards and certifications that live behind the scenes to be able to get on the plane and ride it effectively and create a market around it. And I think that is the journey we're on currently with AI and with the digital economy more generally.
I will say, every time I get on a plane, I am thinking about whether or not all the screws are. There's certain ones you can see it poking out of the wing, and it's a little concerning. That aside, I think nobody here would be shocked to consider that sometimes policy moves quite slow. The digital space moves very fast. Is there a way to effectively address kind of that gap in pacing as things keep changing?
So I'm going to be unhelpful and point to the things that stand in the way, or the things that are hard, rather than suggesting the ways in which you can overcome them necessarily. But I think they're real, and as I say, pointing out tensions is at least a starting point to thinking about how to get to a better spot. So one of the tensions is within our Westminster system. So we know that in the kind of hierarchy of flexibility, the least flexible is legislation. The most flexible is some sort of kind of self-adopted protocol or code that people can kind of nimbly move around with. The reality is that our duly elected politicians are not particularly keen on the notion of relegating the vast majority of effective governance of the digital society to self-governed codes or nimble kind of agile governance mechanisms that can be self-policed, because it turns out that they're not particularly trusting of the actors on the other side. That makes it challenging to do what we know is potentially more flexible approaches to good governance, which is to say, let's actually only legislate it at the level of principle and at outcome, and then allow for regulations, guidance, and certifications and standards to kind of follow in behind. I've now done, I don't know, a few dozen legislative amendments and changes over the course of my career. And I've had to, in at least one instance, produce arguably fake regulations, in the sense that the law provided regulation-making power, but I needed to kind of show my future work in order to get my legislation through. And so I think that is a natural tension that I think is one of the things that stands in the way of being fast. The other is principles-based legislative approaches turns out run into challenges when you actually want meaningful enforcement. And that is certainly one of the challenges that we've run into in the modernization of PIPEDA, was people love principles-based approaches to legislation until you tell them that there's actually going to be meaningful monetary penalties associated with noncompliance. And then
quite rightly, industry turns to you and says, but you're going to have to tell me in extraordinary granularity exactly what you want me to do so that I can avoid these penalties and fines. To which you said, I thought you liked principles-based legislation. And you said, well, yes, but you also have to tell me exactly what I'm supposed to do so that I can defray my risks. So that's a tension. And then third is, I think, this notion that government in and of itself has a fundamental additional fiduciary obligation to its citizens that is often different in the risk calculus than some of what is available or practiced in the private sector, which is to say when you're going to adopt new technologies, for instance, as a good use case, doing that in citizen-facing services when you're talking about the old age security system or the guaranteed income supplement is, notwithstanding the fact that it's meaningful to do it at a telecommunications company or an insurance provider, is still different than when you're actually the government. And the willingness of citizens to be able to see government as early adopters is considerably lower, notwithstanding the fact that they will still complain and say, I can, book my tire replacement online and have them come to my house and I can do it in 6 seconds. Why can't I do that for my passport? And then you say, well, would you be willing for us to, run a risk of adopting a brand new technological system that actually is going to require that and share your personal information with a whole bunch of, third-party providers to be able to enable that type of service? And then it turns out citizens get a little wary. So I think I've not been helpful in answering your question about can we be quick. I'd say those are the fundamental tensions that hamper our ability to be quick. But I think there are pathways through that, particularly with more deliberative processes that actually ideally get those politicians on side for what is going to live in the subsequent efforts, helping the industry on what good compliance looks like, and then helping the citizens on understanding the value proposition of transformation, including what the status quo of tech debt actually legitimately means in terms of how many of their old age security checks are actually being held together with bubble gum and Scotch tape.
And I guess on that note, do you think we're actually on the path to maybe doing that?
I feel optimistic. I'm supposed to. I am the Secretary to the Cabinet for Artificial Intelligence. My job was not created out of a sense of ambivalence about the possibilities of the technological opportunity before us. I tell that to people all the time when I describe their secretariat. We weren't created to be neutral about AI. We weren't created so that we could come back and in 2 years tell the government what they should think about AI and whether or not it was good or bad. We were created on the premise that there is fundamental good that can come out of this technology and its deployment in our economy, in our society, and in international arenas. And we are trying to chart a path that actually sees us meaningfully address that leadership across all of those dimensions. And so, I'm arguably paid to be optimistic.
And is there anything in this new role that's been particularly surprising or anything that you've had to deal with like that?
Yes. I would say the thing that surprised me is also a confirmation of why I think we exist, which is I sort of knew going in that the rationale for the Secretariat was that there is just a ridiculous amount of activity related to artificial intelligence happening across the economy and within the federal family, and that the real risk of that is that it would not amount to greater than the sum of its parts. And so I have been buoyed by the places I am seeing and the instances of AI that I am seeing in all sorts of parts of both our society, our economy, and in government. But I also recognize that it is justifiable then that we really need to make sure that we are strategically cohering that effort to maximize our impact, because there is a great chance that we will actually lose out on this opportunity to lead because of the fact that our efforts are uncoordinated or siloized.
Thank you so much, Mark and Hannah. So we're going to take 10 minutes for a quick break. Help yourself to coffee, tea, charcuterie, and we'll be back for our second panel. Yes, right there.
Hello? Okay, folks, we're going to start panel session 2. If I could get everyone to take their seats.
So I think that's your mic, and then this is your. I'm gonna put it there, or that's not yours. The other one is yours. This one's mine. Yeah. Thank you.
I was an elementary school teacher in my former life. I'm going to start turning the lights on and off. Can I get everyone to take their seats, please? Okay, so we're going to start our second half of the program. Advancing Collaborative Impact is the session that's going to focus on how to foster collaboration between technical experts, policymakers, and stakeholders. Our moderator today is Valerie Gervais, who is the founder and CEO of Orchestra Communications, and my business partner. She's awesome. Valerie will introduce the rest of the panel.
Great. Thank you, Franca. So when I was first asked to host a panel or to moderate a panel on digital policy, I thought this is not the place for me. But when I heard about the topic, public engagement, it's something I feel very passionate about. And I'm really pleased with the panel that we've put together. Thank you, Franca, for putting this great panel together. So let's get started. My first panelist here is Rodrigo, did I get that right? Rosales List, also known as Rod. And he's a senior executive in the Canadian Public Service, currently serving as Senior Director, Service Modernization and Digital Transformation at Indigenous Services Canada. Did I get that right? Yes. He's an intrapreneur who has transformed departments into dynamic ecosystems reflecting the spirit of modern startups. And he's had many accomplishments, including the founding of Public Safety Canada, leading digital transformation, including AI adoption at Indigenous Services Canada, and I'm sure many more that we could talk about. On the end here, I have Michelle Austin. She's the Vice President of Public Affairs at Bell Canada. Prior to that, she held a similar role at Twitter. And she's going to be able to provide a unique perspective, I think, on how larger corporations engage in public consultations. And last but not least, we have Sue Gardner, who's a board member of the Canadian Internet Society. She is an internet innovator, and we don't use those words lightly. She was the long-time head of the Wikimedia Foundation, which operates Wikipedia. Before that, she ran the cbc.ca, the English language website of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. And today, when she's not involved with the Canadian Internet Society, she's a consultant. She's a board member on many other organizations, and yeah, and an advisor to a variety of nonprofits and startups, mostly in the realm of technology, media, and digital freedoms. So today what we want to do is we want to give the federal government, or we want to maybe some guidance, some advice on how we could engage in public consultations in the future to make them more inclusive, make them more productive, make them more relevant. And so to get the question started, I think maybe we could go to you, Rodrigo.
Ladies first, or?
No, let's start with you.
Right,
because with your background at Indigenous Services Canada, I think it'd be interesting to hear some of the successes you've seen,
Perfect. Thank you so much, Valerie, and what a privilege to be here, and thank you to my co-panelists here. It's an absolute honor to be here with you. So you rolled your R's very effectively. Thank you so much for that, Rodrigo Rosales. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. I'm going to be talking to you as we frame this conversation a little bit about Indigenous Services Canada, and you mentioned it. I've worked at Public Safety Canada. I've also worked at other security-related organizations, RCMP. And I have to admit, this is the first time in my career where it's so empowering to see the impact that you're having on Canadians. And Indigenous Services Canada is relatively a new organization in the scale of government. It was created as part of the Liberal government pledge to really empower Indigenous people to do their own governance. So basically, they created Indigenous Services Canada to basically put in one basket all the services to Indigenous so that we could provide those services in a culturally appropriate way. But also, it was the first time in my career listening to the mandate of an organization which is to cease to exist one day. So they were talking about the devolution, the transfer of responsibilities. So that to me was, I mean, that was the first time that I even heard the word devolution, which is basically this transfer and empowering so the Indigenous communities would be able to govern themselves. They created two organizations out of like the legacy departments. There was the CERNAC, which is Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs, which negotiates treaties, makes sure that our sovereignty in the North is protected as well. That's an organization that will always need to exist. But Indigenous Services Canada, our goal is to, within 10 years of the creation of the department, to be able to transfer control of all the services to Indigenous. Now we're already at year 5. I'll let you make your own judgment on whether or not we'll meet that goal, but it's basically our big, hairy, audacious goal to transfer that ownership of services. And if you read the legislation that created our department, every single department in town has a piece of legislation that says, here's your sandbox, here's your mandate. Ours is very, very short, 2 pages. And basically in that legislation, you see black on white that our goal in life is to provide services to Indigenous, to close socioeconomic gaps, that we do that within transparent service standards, and that we do it in a culturally appropriate way in collaboration with the people that we serve. And the organization at first, it was a mishmash of different services, different cultures. There were pieces from Health Canada, pieces from the previous, what it was ANSI, Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development, other pieces from other departments, and we didn't have a cohesive service culture. So my job was basically to look at our services and see how we could improve the services to Indigenous and how we could bring a culture of digital within the organization. And the first thing that we did was just at least try to find out how many services do we have. We didn't even know that. So we eventually found out we had 88 external facing services, of which I can tell you that there's only one that is online end-to-end. So basically most of our services are still very much in-person, paper-based, by mail. And I was confronted with a myth. I was confronted with the myth of Indigenous people are not technically savvy. And I just couldn't buy it. And we did our research. We partnered up with CBC Radio-Canada, who have a media technology arm, who conducted a study of the 1.8 million Indigenous people in Canada. And we realized that we were wrong. They are absolutely very tech savvy. Matter of fact, of the 1.8 million Indigenous in Canada, 30% of them are under the age of 19. So it's a very, very young group of the population. The median age is 32. I think the median age in Canada is about 42 years old. And then when we looked at their habits in terms of consumption of digital products and all that, we realized that 92% of adults had a smartphone or a tablet. When you look at the general population, it's about 82%. So for us, that was that big aha moment that, hey, we need to change things here. And there was this renewed culture to realize that if we really wanted to close the socioeconomic gaps, we really had to aim to provide the best service possible to the population so that we can actually make a dent. It's not just good enough to be the same as the rest. We had to actually try to make a big change, a leap forward, so that we can narrow that gap actually. So that's in the space that we're in right now, and happy to turn it over to my colleagues, but that's maybe just a framing for the rest of the conversation.
Okay, yeah, no, that's great. So I'm going to take it over to you next, Michelle. You've interacted with the federal government on policy issues, particularly digital policy issues, kind of on the other side of things. Could you tell us a little bit about, in your experience, some of the things that have worked well, in which you really felt like, as one of the key stakeholders, you were involved, like you were engaged from the beginning, and maybe just a little bit of perspective on some things that you think maybe didn't work quite as well in you.
Well, thank you very much, Valerie. And I was reflecting on the title of this session, and I think all three words are important: advancing collaborative impact. So, in Ottawa, the number one way I feel like we transact with each other is through a consultation, which is not my favorite way to talk about policy or any subject matter generally. So governments tend to like consultation. It tends to be a one-way transaction. They ask you a question and you submit an answer, and you may see it again, you may not, it all depends. So when I worked for Twitter and we did the online harms consultation or online news consultation, it was actually very, very strictly laid out. They asked you 7 questions, and would please answer those 7 questions. Thank you so much. Versus when you currently, Bell is an internet service provider, so hopefully, everybody here is a Bell customer. And the way that we consult with the CRTC is a little bit broader, right? You have a consultation on a subject matter hearing, you get that. But it's a very binary way to engage. It's not collaboration. I think the next one up would be communication, wherein you have the opportunity to actually have a discussion, a meaningful discussion where each side learns a little something about somebody else. So I think maybe it was Mr. Denton who was talking about draft legislation. Draft legislation is really interesting. Really important to everybody here in the room, and hopefully it's a communication that where you can say, are you drafting something? What does it look like? Is there any way I can see it? Is there any way we can have a discussion about it beforehand? But then the final one, which I think is largely absent but really important and much more dominant, I think, in the private and not-for-profit sector, is actual collaboration, where there is some risk involved and where both parties put something on the table. So I was really interested to hear Schaan talk about best use practices of AI. Okay, well, that's really interesting. How can we collaborate in the AI space? How can we learn what the government maybe is using? And gosh, they must have so much data versus what the private sector has. How can we collaborate? Not necessarily for monetary gain for either side, right? Too many people also think of this as a procurement. Not necessarily as a procurement, but maybe to get better tax law at the end of it. So I think that collaboration is still something that we're working on, especially in the digital space, where savvy digital users actually collaborate faster, where digital companies are much more comfortable with the risk of collaboration than governments are.
Sue, do you have anything you'd like to add to all that has been said in the last couple of minutes?
Sure. Of course I do. Is my mic on? Can you guys check me? Thank you very much. I used to work in radio 1,000 years ago, so I have to check the audio. So thank you for your introduction, Valerie. So you did kind of unpack my CV, but I will unpack, I guess, the part that's most relevant to this room, which is, so I did work at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation for a really long time. I ran CBC.ca. Then I moved to the United States and ran the Wikimedia Foundation. So I was out of Canada for, I do not remember how many years, maybe 15 years, something like that. And I came back towards the end of the pandemic for reasons related to Donald Trump version 1 and the pandemic itself. And when I came back, so prior to that, all of my work had been making digital things. That's what I did, right? When I was coming back to Canada, I was hearing from friends here that Canada was on the cusp of doing a whole bunch of digital policy, what turned into C11, C18, and online harms. And so I thought, well, that's great because I have all this digital experience. I will walk back into the country and I will help, right? I will help them create their digital policies. And so I think that's why I'm on this panel, is because my sense, everybody else in the room is an expert who has dedicated their entire career to this practice. I have 6 minutes. And so I think I'm a fresh voice or something. I'm hoping that my sort of high-level experiences since coming back are a little bit interesting or useful for people. I did do, continuing to unpack my CV for 1 second, I did do a year as the professor of practice at the McGill Max Bell School of Public Policy, so I have this much actual credential, but public policy is not my background, not like you folks. And I think that my experience since coming back and getting a little bit involved in some of these things it's interesting for me to hear what you say about the consultation processes, because I've experienced them as an outsider, who's not an expert and not a lawyer and not a policy person. Shortly after I came back, I had a couple meetings with folks at the CRTC because I was interested in what seemed to be happening with C11 and with C18. And they told me, folks there told me very sincerely, I think that they were really interested in getting the opinions of like ordinary people trying to speak on behalf of the public interest as they understood it. Can I just ask, is anybody here from the CRTC? Okay, it's okay, even if you were. I say this with love. But they did, I think, very sincerely want the engagement of people like me as well as experts. And so I got put on some kind of mailing list where they would sometimes send me their consultation prompts, and I would visit the link. And the most recent one that I visited, I think, is 50 questions. I think it's a 15 or 20-page form, and it's 50 questions, and they're unbelievably arcane. They're things like this is your life, right? I know. But for someone like me, they're unbelievably arcane. They're like subsection 647,000 point whatever. And I feel like that is legit, right? And when you're down in the weeds doing weeds things, you need that, I'm sure, level of specificity is really super important. But I feel, and I would be interested to hear from other folks here, but what I feel like, what seems to me to be missing from that process is a good basic grasp of what the people want, right? Like, what are the people thinking about? What are the issues that people are thinking about? So, when I think about digital policy, I'll wrap up in 1 second, but when I think about like digital policy, when I first came back to Canada, my uncle lives a 20-minute drive from here, and my uncle cannot get high-speed internet. It just doesn't exist, and he's 20 minutes from here, right? My uncle is hungering. He's a friend. He's a member of the Friends of Canadian Broadcasting. It's now just Friends, and I think he feels like they do a little bit of advocacy on his behalf. But he is dying to tell someone at the CRTC that he would really like high-speed internet, right? He has a very simple message. It's not 50 questions and it's not 20 pages. He would just like someone to be thinking about him and his needs in the 21st century.
That's very important. So you were nodding a lot when she was talking about, the engaging and the communications challenges maybe with understanding what maybe the questions that the federal government is asking or that we're being asked as we're engaging. Do you have any,
It might sound cliche nowadays to be talking about human-centered design, but I think that sometimes we may be our own worst enemies because we think we know the answer, right? We know what the end product should look like. And I think that maybe even comes back from like Henry Ford, where he even said famously, if I listen to my clients, they all basically would want a faster horse. But I think we should be past that, right? Like we should be past that, and we should be actually listening in and trying to get some of that input at various levels. And I can tell you, like from like firsthand stories that I've heard from Indigenous communities, and it's so empowering to hear the experience that we've made them go through. And you're like, oh my God, like you're right, like that doesn't make sense at all, right? Like, I mean, but we thought that would have been the best approach to do things. I'll give you a very concrete example, and that's what I was nodding at. We at Indigenous Services Canada have the registration program, and it's a program where basically you get your status card, and we were kind of patting ourselves in the back because we managed to reduce the client experience from a questionnaire that took an average 30 minutes down to 10. And we were patting ourselves in the back, and then when we were consulting with the communities, this gentleman came to see me and said, well, I mean, if that's like your measure, the thing that you have forgotten is that I actually have to put on my coat, grab my car keys, leave the house, travel over 2 hours from my community to get to one of your service kiosks to get the service. And then the last time I went, I actually had to overnight because you weren't able to provide me the service. So your timer does not start the moment that you're in there with the client. The timer starts the moment the client is actually thinking about getting that service. So that's where we have to change our paradigm and get closer to that citizen, that client-facing center design, that human-centered design. And we're still not there yet, even if it sounds cliche nowadays in 2024. So thank you for the question.
Okay, so back over to you. If we could, if you could design a consultation process, right? From the federal government, what would that look like? Like, what would be the best case scenario? You talked a little bit about some of the things, being kind of put on the spot with questions that maybe, didn't give you the opportunity to provide the input that you wanted and stuff. What would the ideal consultation process look like as a stakeholder, from a stakeholder perspective?
Yeah, certainly. Well, the fun thing about the private sector is most of us usually have a product in the real world that has to be sustained. And so it would be super fun if the government would take some time to get to know what our product was, and on a regular basis. So I don't even think I would start with a consultation. I would start more on the experiencing what it is that the private sector does. So come on over to the ubiquitous central office across the street here and see what it takes to coordinate fiber, or come on a dig with us, actually just up the street where the Canadian Shield starts, and see how fun that is. So I think that it would start with a much more openness from governments to understand that it's not just an academic exercise. I mean, consultations are sometimes buried in legislation, right? You are required to do this sort of consultation and it becomes habit. What would be very helpful would be for the governments, without thinking that it's lobbying or without thinking that it's biased, which is a very sort of Ottawa mindset, to say, okay, what is it that you do? So status card, really interesting. So you have a one-time transaction with the status card, but then that status card goes out and lives in the real world, and you go to Tanger, and you try and get the discount or you don't pay tax and all the privileges that come with the status card. So maybe there should be a QR code that is on that status card that can be universally accepted by retailers, so that the 16 and 17-year-olds who've never seen a status card know what it is, know what it means, and are able to honor the privileges that come with the status card. So I think that to start with an openness to collaboration does assume a sort of risk, and it does ask you to step out of what is a large bureaucratic process in government and say, maybe we can look at this from a different perspective. So that would, that's not terribly helpful, but what I always say at Bell is, we have a product. How's the product? How goes the product? What's going on with the product? So that would be a start.
So just the panel, not the panel, the Fireside chat just before the break, they were talking, they touched upon the fact that, totally losing my train of thought here. So I'm just going to skip to another question. What are some, so consultations, I'm assuming, have changed a lot in recent years with new technology and stuff like that? No? There you go. This is going to be our question. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about how, some of the technological changes that the federal government or your department more specifically is implementing to get this feedback, some of the stuff that, and then maybe we could follow on along with the.
Yeah, that's great, for sure. The one thing to understand about Indigenous Canadians is that when you talk about Indigenous, there's not one group that represents all the interests of Indigenous Canadians in Canada. I was getting the question at the beginning of the session today by Ian here. How many Jesse. How many Indigenous communities do we have in Canada? And I couldn't even answer it because I think there's over 600 communities in Canada. And there's different groups, right? There's First Nations, there's Inuit, there's Métis, and all these groups have their own vision of what they want Canada to look like, right? So there's not one group that represents all of these interests. And this happens in society as well. And where I want to take this is into an analogy to a consultation process that exists within Public Safety Canada, where I think they've done a great job in terms of trying to embed different perspectives from Canadians. And they have a vehicle which is called the Cross-Cultural Roundtable on Security, where basically they have community leaders from various community groups that are acting almost as a sounding board before policies or before big changes are happening in the public safety space. So you have people who might represent the Black community, might represent the Jewish community, the Tamil community, and I think that should be a best practice across in not just private sector, not just public sector, but also private sector, in terms of having kind of like a sounding board where you can close some of those big, I would say like big blind spots that you may have because we might not be surrounding ourselves with enough of the diversity in the population to drive that change. So,
Sounds good. Did you want to?
Yeah, I was gonna. Yeah, it's interesting you would say that. It's so interesting you would say that because when I first got back and I was following C11, I was interested in like who the government was talking to, who the CRTC, et cetera, was talking to, right? And so I did an analysis of to what degree were they talking to industry and to what degree were they talking to like civil society, right? And I have numbers. Yeah, I have a tiny chart. I have a tiny table. And it was really interesting because, and I can't read it because I don't have my glasses, but something like north of 80%, I think, on average across, this was the House of Commons Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage, the Senate Committee on Transport and Communications, and lobbyist communications to heritage and to the CRTC. And they were almost all to industry. That's what I found striking. There were actually a couple of striking things, but that was one of them, was something like 4/5, north of 4/5 were industry organizations that the government was talking to. And you can understand why, right? Because they are right there and they are paid to answer your 50 questions. They are paid to do it and they have skills and they're lawyers and et cetera. But it really does leave aside, I think, not on purpose, but it has the effect of leaving aside a whole bunch of civil society groups and groups that aren't even, or demographics that aren't even represented by a civil society organization, right? Like when I first started talking to people in government about the internet stuff, I was constantly saying, I'm speaking in the public interest as I understand it. And people seem to find that a little bit confusing. It was like, what? Like, aren't you with a company? Like, who is paying you to be here, you know? I just find it interesting. And I also would like to make an add-on comment, which was the other thing I discovered when I did this number crunching, was that the other piece that was really, I felt, very underrepresented. Like, we have to understand we're operating in the context of 21st century today, right? And almost everybody who was being consulted with was what I would call like a legacy organization, not a digital first thing, right? And that was also really interesting because we're talking about digital policy and they're just, the folks who were being consulted with were typically not digital first. One thing that was interesting watching C18 and C11, in those processes, new organizations formed to talk to the government, right? We saw, I think it was a Digital Media Publishers Association of some kind formed halfway through C18. And in C11, I think the YouTube creators, a bunch of creators got together and formed some kind of association. And it's like, oh, people are starting to get a PhD in government because that's what's required, right? To make sure that your interests are represented at the table. But it's very new, right? It's very nascent. Like that expertise, that government relations expertise doesn't quite exist yet. There's a sort of separate subsequent question, which is, ought it to exist? How much of that should be necessary? But at this time, it is necessary in this country, right? And yet it isn't really there. And so I think that has a distorting effect on outcomes, right? If you're hearing primarily from legacy organizations and you're hearing primarily from private sector organizations.
Wow. Yeah, it's a perfect segue for.
Well, I mean, if you're going to say that a telecommunications company are guilty as charged of burying everything in process, you would be right. We are a federally regulated industry, and we have so much process coming out of every corner, and we have professional process people who will, answer your 87 CRTC questions in great detail in a way that I can't understand what it is, because that's the way that we've always done it, and that's the way that clogs up the system, and sometimes that's the best way to get going. So what's the best way to improve process? It's not going to be rocket science for you. Plain language, right? Plain language would be really helpful on all sides. Go to where people are. So if everybody's on Facebook/Meta, go have your discussion there on Facebook Meta. If everybody's on Blue Sky, go over there. Is there going to be an opportunity to game the system? Absolutely. Is telecommunication gaming the existing system? Absolutely. And then the other thing I think that's really important, and again, tying back into what Mark said, in this age where I know Google knows instantly what's happening with me, and they have a dashboard and they have feedback instantly, and that's the feedback that Google gets is in real time, and it's really helping them make decisions. Why are the rest of us not doing that? Why don't we have a dashboard for every CRTC consultation? Why are we not able to publish statistics in real time in this country? Why is it 5 years after the census comes we get that information out? I don't know what the disincentive is. Well, there's probably lots of it, but there's so many tools, and now there's AI in order to be able to have us have these conversations in real time, be able to analyze the data through new technologies and sift that conversation forward. So I think there's a ton of opportunity to hit the impact side of what this panel wants to discuss, but it's going to involve risk, and on all sides.
I don't know if I should feel better now knowing that Bell is also buried under process. I thought it was only government. So.
Any federally regulated organization will tell you.
All right, sounds good. So, in terms of technology, right? Like how we could, you talked about plain language, about going where people are there things right now that are being implemented at the public service to engage with these audiences that are more remote? You've mentioned what you've discovered. What are your plans in terms of changing how you?
So I think, like Mark mentioned, he was optimistic. I'm also very optimistic, but I think the promise of AI, robotics, and process automation, which, by the way, if I had that $1 extra in my pocket today, that's exactly where I would put it rather than AI, because there's so much process and there's so much promise to make processes more efficient. So I think we're at that point in time where we're cautiously optimistic about how we can embed more of these practices, and we're really, really conscious about bringing in extra efficiencies, and I think the writing's on the wall as well in terms of what could happen in the near future with changing government. So we're really, really cautious. Government is getting a squeeze right now, as you know, in terms of like the budgets. So it's how can we make more with less, or really focus on the things that matter most. So I think that's where technology has this promise. The one area I have to be super transparent with you is about education, making sure that employees, that personnel are well educated in terms of the tools, what they can do with it. And also for us in IT, as IT experts, is also trying to learn how to get out of the way, because we often are our own worst enemies in terms of instating process or instating rules or instating frameworks that don't allow necessarily employees to be empowered to work at the speed of technology today. So I think that's an area where we're trying to push and change the culture internally within government to be able to remove some of those barriers. Some of you may have heard about citizen development programs. I think that's where we want to move the space to, because you cannot be the only ones in IT in terms of the monopoly when technology nowadays is so accessible. So for us, that's where we're trying to push education, and as well making sure that there are frameworks for people to be able to accelerate development.
Is this something that the private industry, like a private-public partnership, you were talking about, budget cuts, and, sometimes things are sexy, and sometimes they're a little less sexy depending on, the political climate. Is this an area where the public and the private sector could kind of come together to better inform policy to?
In the digital space, I think absolutely, and I don't think there's any of it necessarily going on. So, I always say digital policy, you shouldn't make digital policy separate from what's going on in the real world, right? If you're able to do it in the real world, you should be able to do it in the digital world, and vice versa. If you're doing something in the digital world that the government wants to regulate, stop, control, Well, hopefully you're doing the same thing in the real world as well. So Public-Private Partnerships Canada, I think, is like truly the only 3P existing organization for the government, and it's for infrastructure. I think that it would be really interesting to start that from a digital point of view. I think you want to be very clear, though, what the problem is you're trying to solve, and then have the ability to work together.
I want to come back to this concept of a checklist. So you mentioned, Michelle, very briefly while you were speaking, it was just a line that you said, it's a checklist. There's a process for consulting, and sometimes it feels like somebody's just checking off boxes. Obviously, as part of education, sometimes a checklist could be useful, right? You need to do A, B, C to make sure you're reaching your, the different people. But how could we kind of, keep these standard, maybe built into, policy process of consulting people, and have certain standards, right? We're gonna give 30 days. I don't know, right? But how could we do that and at the same time remain flexible and responsive to the changing needs without necessarily relying on this checklist and saying, okay, we sent out our 30 questions, they've been sent out, people had 2 weeks to answer them, we got our answers, that was your chance. How could we change it so that we go beyond a checklist into meaningful engagement? What are some things that we could do? I don't know if you want to take that away, or Sue?
I could just get us started.
Yeah.
I think, believe it or not, there's such a thing as consultation fatigue. And we see it in the Indigenous space, where they basically get bombarded with questions from various groups. So there might be a lack of coordination, right, from different government departments, and then it's the same groups over and over that get all the same questions all the time, right? So I think there is that need to have better federal coordination and better relationship in terms of making sure that we are sharing within ourselves whatever it is that has come as information, and being more open in terms of that feedback that we have received in the government space, in the federal space. So that is something that I am really conscious as well, making sure that we're not overdoing it, and that when we're doing it in a meaningful way, and that the findings are shared. So I think that's part of, I guess, my lessons learned from there.
I think that's super real, and I've heard Indigenous people talk about that, right? That there's always someone knocking at their door, asking that questions. Yeah, I tend to come at this from the perspective of like, again, ordinary people, right? And I think that they don't feel over consulted with, right? They don't feel like people are asking a lot of questions about what they want and need. And to me, I think at its heart, it is a culture question. I think you said this earlier. It's a culture question, which is you have to, if you're in government, you're in the CRTC, whatever, you have to want to know what people think. And I know, when I ran the Wikimedia Foundation, we were ridiculously, that organization is ridiculously transparent and ridiculously consultative, and everybody had an opinion about everything. And we did it with very old technology. We did it with like mailing lists and stuff like that, right? We didn't have anything fancy. And it can be, of course, exhausting, right, to sort of wade through everybody's input and try to figure out who to pay attention to and what really matters, and et cetera. It's hard. But you have to do it, and you have to engage in it with an open mind and wholeheartedly, right? Like, if you don't really want to do it, people can tell. They can feel it, right? And then they just opt out. And if they stop giving you their input, that's even worse than if they give you too much of their input, because that means they've checked out, right? And you were talking earlier about trust, right? Trust in the system, trust in the systems, right? If people don't think you're interested in what they have to say, trust goes down. If you don't ask them what they think, trust goes down. One way to push trust up, behavioral economics taught us this. I think I forget his name, Dan Ariely, wrote about how if you ask someone their opinion, they immediately like you more, right? Like, of course we do, right? So we should ask, and we should listen, and we should care. And, an observation I would make again in my time back here has been that my sense is that folks who should be asking for input and grateful to get it often seem to see it as a burden, right? There are some Canadians on the scene who are just incredibly knowledgeable, and if I were writing legislation or working on regulatory stuff, I would make them my first call. There's some people who are just like really, really knowledgeable. They know lots of stuff. It would be a joy to pick their brains. And it doesn't seem like that's the orientation. It's funny. It seems like the folks who should be seeking feedback see it often more as a problem and something to be sort of managed. You have to do the minimum or people will get mad at you, as opposed to seeing it as a rich wealth of resource and knowledge and information that can help you do your job in a much better way, right? That must come from, like you alluded, a scarcity mindset, right? Like it must come from a sense that you're overburdened, there's too much to do, there's not enough time, there's not enough money. It must come in part from that, no?
One of the things I have been trying to pitch to the organization is imagine there was like a TripAdvisor, but for government services. I don't think any of our services would score 5 stars. So I think that's a very, it's a wealth of knowledge that we're missing out in terms of having systematic feedback built into every single service interaction that you have with a citizen. How was our service rated, right? So I think to your point, right, there must be a better way to get that feedback in.
Right, and that reminds me of an experience I had, again, I don't know why I'm picking on the CRTC, I don't mean to. But the CRTC has a map, it publishes a map, which is access to high-speed broadband internet, right? And when I live in the forest, and when I moved back to this part of the world, I checked that map and it told me I had 6 options for high-speed internet. I have 0 options for high-speed internet. I talked to my uncle. My uncle is like, yeah, no kidding. Welcome to my world, right? But that is trust diminishing, right? That is like, and I would not give that a good rating on TripAdvisor. I just would not, right? Because someone's not checking. Someone's put it up, but not checking it and validating it, right? So, not awesome.
Yeah, the product in the real world. I would say 2 things. When I first arrived at Twitter, and I had spent a lot of time in government, for every product that we put out, and product can mean an actual, tangible thing or a service, or it can be a submission. At the end, we had to do a retro. And I was like, what is this retro business? I really was terrible at retros, and I couldn't figure out why. And it's because I think it's because I came from government where the success is getting the thing out the door. And you not necessarily think, oh, now what has happened to that thing? And I'll give you an example. C-18, which is the Online News Act, which the response from Meta was they stopped they stopped publishing Canadian news. At Bell, we have radio stations, and Meta scoped us in. That if your country radio station had on its website a blurb about news, you were scoped into Meta's ban. And that was not what, we never figured that would be a consequence of what that was, but there was no way to go back on to the government and say, wait a minute. We actually, in Quebec, we launched, because we're crazy, new broadcasting services, and they were doing really well in terms of attracting new listeners on Meta. And when we were no longer allowed to publish anything related to Nouveau on Meta, it had a real impact on our bottom line, which brings me to my second point, is that we tend to forget that a lot of these consultations do have an enormous impact on the bottom line of companies. And the bottom line of companies isn't just revenue, it's jobs. And so I'm not saying that consultation shouldn't be done. I think consultation is exceptionally important and exceptionally should be formal, especially when there's a bottom line that's involved, which there is all the time in telecommunications and broadcasting. The CRTC can make a decision that will stop us from making an investment. Why would we do this? If it's going to be regulated or it has to be shared, we're not going to make that investment. So the other thing that I think that is extremely important is to understand the economic impact of your consultation, collaboration, communication.
Can I ask, does Bell have a position on C-18 now?
Why would we have a position on C-18 now? It's done. So I think that, that's a great example where we did have a position. I think we were supportive of C-18 quietly in the background through the Canadian Association of Broadcasters. In reality, when C-18 came to fruition, Bell was shocked by the outcome of what happened, because we hadn't anticipated it. So, but there is, I guess the question is, where would that position live at night now? Because that's done.
So I want to go back to something that you mentioned, Sue. Do we still have time?
Franca's gone.
Franca's gone. Okay, we'll just talk till she tells us we need, yeah. 5 minutes? Okay. So I want to take it back to a point you made about, see, now I lost my train of thought again. This is, yeah, just make something up. No, you mentioned something about, you know, a whole bunch of new associations forming in the wake of C11 or C18. I can't remember which one it was that you were mentioning. And then we talked a bit about, you know, fatigue, right? And we had, you know, and experts. And I know, right, you know, those key experts, I think we call on you often, Michelle, like, you know, like those experts, they're also very taxed, and all these, you know, these associations are kind of, what could we do in terms of, you know, putting aside the federal government, not that you're not very important, but what could we do as different associations, organizations to work better collaboratively, to better engage those experts, and to, you know, maybe, you know,
I kind of want to sort of challenge the premise of that a little bit, because what I've been thinking about, you know, I was driving in to be on this panel, and I was listening to, do you guys know Jen Gerson, who is the co-founder of The Line? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I was listening to Jen, to their podcast, and I wrote down what she said because I thought it was just so striking. She said, she was talking about how Canada functions, right? And she said, in Canada, the people who get ahead in this country are the people who are best at navigating the federal government. And then, yeah, and then she went on to be critical of that, right? And to talk about how that mitigates against innovation and productivity, and instead leads to insider dealing and rent seeking, right? And so I was kind of sad when I saw the YouTube creators and the other sort of indie creators forming their association, because I thought that, and my feelings have some ambivalence in them, but I thought generally that it was kind of awesome that there were these creative people doing this stuff in the absence of any sort of interaction with government, right? That they were just making stuff, and they had such interesting stories about how they started their work, and then they were responsive to feedback they were getting. And I think there was a company where the woman who founded the company started off, I think her original goal was to teach babies English with songs, and then through iteration and responding to audiences and giving people more of what they seem to want, she ended up making this company that I believe teaches people who don't speak English but want to live in Canada how to speak English through songs. It was like, what? Like, no one would have predicted that. She would have never set out to create that, right? But just by following desire paths, right? Like, just by responding, that's where she ended up. And it's just so interesting, all this sort of fecundity, all this sort of creativity and stuff happening. And it made me a little bit sad when those people decided that they now need to form an association to send people to Ottawa with briefing documents and whatever, right? And the same was true for the digital indie people. And the digital indie people, the news people, talked extensively during the C18 process about how their preference is to pay attention to their audiences, right? They want to delight the people who they are trying to serve, and so they want to spend all their time. When I was at the Wikimedia Foundation, I created the business model for Wikipedia, which is everybody gives $2, and that is a lot of money, and so the thing is financially totally fine. I was thrilled when we were able to make that work, because I wanted to pay attention to the readers of Wikipedia. I didn't want to pay attention to the Knight Foundation or something, right? Or the government of whatever, right? And the digital news producers, that is how they see the world. They want to pay attention to their end user. They want to delight that person, give them news that is useful to them. They want a podcast, they get a podcast, right? They don't want to be sitting in government environments, right? Speaking to government people. And I think that that is a good impulse, right? It's a good impulse. So where that would lead me in answer to your question is maybe, although I'm all in favor of collaboration, I'm all in favor of people talking all the time and learning more about each other's worlds, maybe there's something to be said for people just doing their thing,
True. Did you want to add anything to that?
Well, just to say, to encourage everybody, including myself, to go out and find voices that you wouldn't usually listen to. It's on you. And I think it's on corporations too. Like, who can we get? Well, go out and find somebody. You're listening to podcasts. There's lots of really interesting people out there who we're not tapping into. So it's really important, especially for somebody like me, to make the effort to find them.
That's good.
I know I'm not the one asking questions here, but I'm wondering, we all have heard podcasts about the Deutsch, the Department of Government Efficiencies. So is that something that you're welcoming kind of thing, or is that something that also
Are we talking about Elon Musk here?
Yes. You're like me, curiously, curious. I have my popcorn set aside to watch what's going to happen.
So I said this earlier today. Don't forget, I have PTSD from Elon Musk, who invited me to leave, along with 70% of the company, right? And so here's the thing about Elon Musk. He's asking people to do things differently, right? He's challenging your assumptions. He's looking at things in simple language. We're going to let go everybody whose social insurance number ends in an odd number, right? Okay, wow, that's a really interesting thing to look at. You're shifting my paradigm. You're asking me to do things differently. So I think it's very clear that he's on to something generally with his view of the world. I don't subscribe to it, but I do think it's important to have voices like that and counter voices out there, and to consider what he's asking us to do.
Balance. Thank you.
No, not necessarily balance, but how about insight? There we go.
Sue, did you want to respond to that quickly?
That's very generous.
That's very
I've been practicing.
I love it.
Planted question.
And did you have anything to add to
No,
that,
no,
or
I'm
it
good
was
with
just
that.
the
Thank you,
question?
yeah.
So I think we're going to wrap things up. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. What a great discussion. Thanks, Michelle, Sue, Rodrigo, and Valerie. I'm going to ask the last panel to come on up.
So we're short one mic, so two of you will share.
Okay, so our last panel today is Foresight in Digital Policy. And I'd like to introduce our moderator, Jesse Hirsch, futurist farmer, knowledge professional, public speaker, and punk. Okay, Jesse, I'll let you take it away.
I'm still shocked that someone would have a moderator who claims to be a punk actually moderate. And I will not be introducing our panel because, like many of you, I am meeting them for the first time today. And who would I be to pretend that I know anything about you other than consulting our local algorithmic authority, Google, who I do trust. But nonetheless, I would like to hear you guys say, what's your name? What's your organizational affiliation? And on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is dystopia and 10 is utopia, how you feeling about the future?
I am not a punk.
Who would have thought?
And you'll know very quickly why not. My name is Anil Arora. I just recently retired as the Chief Statistician of Canada at the end of this last fiscal year in March. And I am currently a professor of digital governance and leadership at Harvard, as well as doing some consulting in the data and digital space worldwide. In terms of 0 to 10, I don't know. I'm feeling kind of optimistic today. I would say we're probably sitting at a 7.5 or so.
Nice. Hi, everyone. My name is Shannon Lundquist. I'm a vice chair, and I lead our federal practice at Deloitte Canada. I'm a tech optimist as well, and a strong believer in AI for good. So that will obviously have a flavor on my comments today. I think I am at a 6.5 today.
Still on the positive side.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jeanette Patel. I lead Google's public policy team, here in Canada. I'm also, it won't shock you, a tech optimist. And when I think about, on a scale of 0 to 10, where I'm at, when I think about the future, I think in the short term, maybe a 7. And in the longer term, definitely an 8.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Yana Lukashe. I'm Senior Principal for Amazon Web Services for Canada at the federal level and Quebec, covering public policy. And Jesse, you know what? You're very dynamic, and I think that's skewing my answer right now. But if I go back to a bit of a reality check for myself, it's going to be a 5.5.
5.5, although technically still all above 5.
Still on the positive side.
You didn't say for you, Jesse.
So for me, I would say right now I'm probably about a 2. But I'm asking the audience, think in your head what that number would be for you right now, and an hour from now, we'll see if that number has changed. So that's why I was going to answer maybe at the end. So now I'm a 2, but given that the average clearly is moving up, that may change by the time we're done. Because we do have the very difficult task of not only talking about the future, but almost oxymoronically talking about the government's perception of the future and its preparedness for the future, which is no small task. And I will briefly start on a definition level, because I was kind of critical of Mark that he didn't define what he meant by trust, and that I'm a big fan of Marshall McLuhan's idea of the rear view mirror effect. The idea that what we perceive as the future is actually the present, and I think AI is a great example of that, and what we perceive as the present is actually the past, and we're constantly trying to catch up. So let's first start with the general question, how could, but I'll even go so far as to say, and should, the government be thinking about the future, right? Should there be, like the famous book, a ministry of the future, right? Should there be more strategic foresight, however you want to define it, in each and every ministry, let alone in the PMO or the PCO? Is the future something the government should be focused on, and how, in a very broad sense? And we can get more into the details as our conversation pulls. Any courageous individual like to go first?
I can start. So I believe we need to, and not just government, I think we societally, individually, and government, we need to get used to thinking about the future, and not in a manifest, crappy destiny way, but around how we will fail, and get comfortable with failing, and particularly as it relates to things like technology. We need to do that in order to create some digital resilience in our systems, in our critical infrastructure, and how we approach planning at all levels of government.
Right on. I'm a big fan of the idea that the future is fail fast and fail often, because then you will definitely get the future you desire. Other thoughts?
Sure, maybe I can jump in here as well. So for us, we see, I think, it in 2 ways. There's a role for government to look inwardly, and there's a role for government to exercise its, leadership skills outwardly. I'm going to be a bit gloomy here, so pardon this, but we are going into very challenging economic innovation cycles, political cycles, and landscapes that are going to challenge the way we do things. And I think we have to be very mindful of that and very cognizant of that, and build the roles for government, for industry, for civil society, for academia, for regular Canadians. And so for us, I think that's going to be 1, reality check, and 2, let's look forward on how do we make sure we build that resilience? What does it take to build critical infrastructure? How do we maximize that? How do we democratize that? What are the challenges and the opportunities, again, within Canada, outside of Canada? And I think, governments have very ambitious policies moving forward. We want Canada to succeed. We want it to become competitive, productive. We want equal opportunity for all Canadians. We want them to build skills. We want them to have jobs. So we need to have a conversation about how do we first level set, and then how do we look to the future, and then the role of each and every one.
Jeanette?
Yeah, I think that kind of connects well to the way I'm thinking about this, because rather than just thinking about the future for future's sake, I think we actually need, as Canada, to be thinking about what are our goals. You know, let's have clarity on the end goal in mind, and then let's, you know, work to achieve that goal. What are what needs to change to achieve that goal? What are our risks and our opportunity? When you think about the role of technology in achieving those goals, what is the risk of the status quo? You know, how do we encourage our government and our society to have an opportunity mindset when we're thinking about this? Because, you know, I think we're really in a place where we need to kind of ride the wave instead of getting bowled over by it. And if we, you know, try and stop that wave, we will fail. So how do we kind of think about what is the end goal? How do we accomplish that together? And how do we seize the moment?
Right on. And I'm hearing a kind of through line here of resilience and ambition kind of working together in a way that I think is really quite positive.
Well, you said you were a big believer in definitions. So, you know, when you say government is so massive a term. You've got municipal, you got regional, you got indigenous, you got, you know, federal, and on and on and on. You've got the politicians, and then you've got the bureaucrats, and then you've got layers and layers and so on. So I'm not going to talk about the government in that amorphous blob. I can tell you as an individual, as a very senior public servant, as a deputy minister, that's all I did was think about, you know, where things are today and where is it that the policymaker is thinking to go and take Canada, and what from a data perspective, from an intelligence perspective, from an information perspective is required in order to shape or at least understand and better be able to contend with the challenges that we're facing. And I would say, you know, just have a look at where we are in Canada compared to many other countries. And I would say we've done a pretty decent job. Now, that's not to say that that means we relax and do the same things. Because guaranteed that would be a recipe for failure, and especially on the technology side of things. So first of all, like, this is not about throw out the, you know, baby with the bathwater. It's about contending with where there are opportunities for us to do a much better job, and so that, you know, give or take 3 points, or, you know, whatever the average is of all of us, 3.5% or points, I guess, differential. What are the key areas that we need to focus in on? And so that's where I think there's a lot of possibilities. And so from whether it's transparency and trust, whether it's the data and the evidence that we need, whether it's the regulatory and the legal frameworks that we need, whether it's the collaboration and working together that we need, and lastly, it's the leadership that we need to exercise both domestically across levels of government with our private sector colleagues, civil society, and other levels of government, as well as what do we need to do on the global stage.
Well, and on that point of leadership, let's kind of segue into strategy, because one of the reasons I'm still kind of at a 2 is when I look at the general voting public, I see a lot of nostalgia. I see a lot of desire for the past, and there isn't really much of an appetite for the type of future I think that we see and that we see as an opportunity. And in the last panel, we sort of, near the end, got into new types of consultation and new types of mobilizing people into the policy process. So what is the strategy to really follow through on this, both on the leadership angle, but also when talking about the resilience and from my view, sort of seeing the target, seeing the goal as a motivator, right? As something that really brings people together. So, and here we don't have to delve within government. We can talk private sector, we can talk civil society, but what are the strategies for achieving this kind of foresight? What are the strategies that normalize talking about the future, that normalize talking about AI, biohacking, a lot of the crazy stuff that circulates in futurist circles that doesn't really make it into policy circles, at least not in a substantive way? Jeanette, you seem to be itching to respond, please.
Well, I'm just going to respond to a little piece of what you said. And that's just, on the public, where the public's mind is at. And I think one of the things that we observed, so we released a report in October looking at, the report was on Google's economic impact in Canada, but one of the things that we were testing for was, the public's view of AI. And what we found, and I don't have the stats in front of me, but I'm happy to share them afterwards, but, unsurprisingly, Canadians who dabbled in AI, who had experimented with it, had a much stronger appreciation for it. There was more of a positive view. And so what does that mean? It's that they're seeing how this improves their lives, how it makes the, whatever their daily grind looks like a little bit easier. And I think that that is so essential, whether we're talking about individual Canadians or businesses, to start to play, start to experiment. They know the problems that they are solving best. They know their problems better than we do. And so if you can get the tools in their hands, they will be able to exploit them in ways that may not have been thought about, right? In ways that are going to drive new outcomes, new innovation themselves. So I think, really have an appreciation for that. And there was a comment on the last panel that I thought was so, it's going to stick with me forever, which is that if you ask people what they, if you ask he said if you asked someone what they wanted, we want a faster horse. Right? Because they're not necessarily thinking about, well, what's on the horizon. But if you can get it in their hands, all of a sudden the possibilities open up.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Jesse. I'll probably answer another portion of the question to complement what Jeanette had mentioned. Looking at it from the angle of productivity, just at its simplistic most, level. And how do you work backwards from that in achieving productivity, whether it's for the government, whether it's for citizens, whether it's for the private sector? Then you go back to what are the type of policies that we need to have in place. And then we start delving into regulatory reform. And so that is a massive exercise that, just to undertake, it would take years to go down that path. But for the technology and the productivity outcome that you want, reform is inevitable. And through looking at the policies that need to be changed in Canada, we talk about consultations. I'll take it a step further and I'll say, why not look at sandboxes? So actual environments in a cloud setting, and a little caveat that rarely innovations happens outside of a cloud setting, including AI, generative AI, and the next innovation that's going to come along as well. And so we have these sandboxes where the participation in controlled and secure environments of government, private sector, academics, civil society can have the opportunity to play around with the power of that technology and looking at the policies without actual implementation. And so there's a wealth of data that can be garnered from that type of exercise that will allow us to look at what different settings we want to achieve in Canada. So fully on for consultations, but within probably an experimental phase, I would say, in sandboxes.
Well, and I would point out that the common thread between both of your answers is play, right? That there is a need to be able to play with these tools, to play with them in environments that allow for mistakes, that allow for errors, and that's never really been the mentality of government, right? And that seems to be one of the issues that get in the way of this. You wanted to respond.
Well, just to say that, I appreciated what Mark's comments earlier said. There are actual barriers to, for example, allowing departments to be able to share data amongst themselves. And to think that, the government as a whole can have the opportunity to look at improving its policies, but yet can't share data amongst each other. So there's a governance issue that needs to be tackled. And then I defer to other like barriers as well in policy, like Copyright Act and whatnot, that really are limiting the ability for private sector to support the public sector in achieving its goals.
I just think, just to add to that, to your sandbox comment, I think there's an opportunity for government to participate in collaborative ecosystems as a main player to get around some of those, like I'll call it fear or orthodoxies that they have about sharing of data. And then that can drive some of the evidence-based data-informed decision-making they need to do around policymaking. Organizations like MILA and of course AI for Good, things that they're working on, Vector Institute around economy, like to really have people, everyday, citizens, people from government, people from industry, obviously, driven by and set up by a number of amazing people in academia, to be able to provide that kind of experimentation, perspective and opportunity for people, because that's what we need. We have to make it real for people.
And again, not to bring it back to leadership, and feel free to take this in a completely different direction, but it strikes me that what we're describing here is the fertile ground for a new kind of leader, right? And a new kind of person who's not just seeing consultation or feedback as a problem to be managed, but as a source of power, as a source of intelligence.
Yeah, I'll come at that in the following way. We have 21st century aspirations as a society. We've got 20th century, if I could be generous, infrastructure, and we still have 19th century thinking. And our systems, our governance is all, like I said, I'm being very generous with the 19th century thinking, because a lot of our systems predate that in terms of how they're set up. And so if we ask the same questions from that 19th century perspective, what are we going to get? So the leadership space in a digital world requires us to kind of place ourselves in that digital world and then ask the kinds of things that are relevant for today and tomorrow. And I guess I'm in a bit of a privileged position because I get to see what's happening in other parts of the world. And they're not going to every application, sandbox, pilot, whatever it is, and saying, what do you think? Was that okay? Were you okay with that? Are you all right with that? No, they're going ahead at a very rapid pace in building the kind of fundamental infrastructures, whether it's person identifiers, business identifiers, the kinds of registers that are basic infrastructure that is needed. They're piggybacking now services on top of those horizontals, not verticals, horizontals. They're building in privacy and confidentiality and ethical frameworks. And then they're asking the questions on the very platforms for citizens to say, how can we make things better for you? And they're saying, yeah, okay, not everybody's going to be able to do that, so what are some of the alternative mechanisms where people can still get the kind of services? They're not afraid to fail fast. They're not, they're not afraid to do agile and iterative types of things. And they're building in the kind of transparency and trust which says, it's not going to be perfect. Tell me what is perfect today. Even in the physical world, nothing is perfect. We've just gotten used to some of the risks, and we've built in the kind of mitigation strategies. We need to do that now with governments, with private sector, with citizens, civil society, in moving forward. But yet, when you see the dialogue, it is a very binary. Do you want to go forward, or do you think we should stay in the old person buggy world? It's the wrong question to ask.
Maybe I'll just add and challenge that ever so slightly, because there's a tendency that we're seeing that as governments are asking those questions and trying to build in that resiliency, which I think they have a different definition of resiliency and agile than private sector does. But that aside, we want to emphasize the public-private partnership. Because what we see the tendency right now in Canada is going almost the opposite, is where the government itself is choosing to build its own infrastructure, to build its own mechanisms, to build its own sovereignty, to build its own data centers. And that would be a concern. So one, it doesn't have the resources to do so. Two, the question begs is, do Canadians pay for it? And three is, well, what really is the role of the private sector at that point as a partner, technology partner to governments and public sector? And frankly, not just to public sector and government, but I include public sector more broadly, the provinces, municipalities, health authorities, school boards, etc. And so there's a democratization that the private sector is able to support more broadly. So, and just to give you a statistic, to kind of make that point, the UN e-government statistic has just recently came out. In Canada, back in 2010 or 2013, to memory is losing me right now, but we were 43rd in the world out of top 50 countries. Years later, we're now 47. So again, my 5.5, I'm slightly optimistic, but then yet challenging because, you know, still after so many years, we haven't managed to get over the hurdle just yet.
And I think, just to add to that too, and I think about your prior role specifically, like in 2019, Canada, first government-wide data strategy, you know, covered everything from, you know, vision, governance, data modeling, op model. And, you know, so 5 years later, and probably hundreds, if not more, current state of, you know, data strategy assessments, very limited movement outside of StatsCan, right, which was the first mover in the space. So, I mean, to your question on leadership and your points, and you know, I think there's courage too, like the people, right? It's hard to take that. What's the first step or the second step?
Well, and I think courage has to be coupled with incentives, right? Because, you know, people have to be rewarded for being courageous, because right now the opposite is true. You will be generally punished for being courageous. And there does seem to be an infrastructure that we're glossing over, which is literacy, right? And how we develop that literacy. I'll come back to that, but Jeanette, you wanted to jump in.
No, I think it's just, you know, to the points that have been made about the need for courage and leadership here. I also think we need to reframe what is risk, like our conception of risk, because there is a real cost to not seizing this moment. It's not just opportunity cost. We've seen in the EU, the Draghi report came out, and really enumerating the economy-wide impact of, in that case, you know, an entirely different approach to regulation of the tech sector in particular, but not limited to. And so, you know, there are generational impacts to missing this moment. And I think, you know, when we look at around the world at who should we be emulating, how can we kind of be more nimble, faster, show more courage. I think part of that is starting with how do we think about risk, and is there actually more risk to you know, not seizing this moment and leaning into it than in just kind of standing still.
I absolutely love that, and it kind of reminds me of what Sue mentioned in the earlier panel, which is there is a lot of talent and intelligence and great perspective in Canada that is not currently part of the policy process. You know, either because to them it's irrelevant, as to many of the YouTubers, but also because there isn't an easy way to plug in. There isn't an easy on-ramp. And I want to come back to this issue of literacy, because my 2 is already now a 4, right? Because hanging out with you guys, I'm reminded, yeah, there really are smart people who think about these issues, versus I'm busy watching Question Period or looking at MPs and going, we're fucked. So how do we foster a sense of literacy, both amongst those who are fortunate enough to be elected, but also, and this goes back to the public-private partnership, but also within the civil service? Because yes, there are really smart people within the civil service, but my primary criticism of you, if you're here in the room, is their view of the world's very narrow, right? They're not spending time, what used to be 4chan, what would be whatever it is today, right? They're not seeing the internet that I see, and they're not creating a legislation or a policy dialogue that actually fits what I think is the real world. So how do we address that issue of literacy? How do we make sure that the people who do have worthy things to input are actually part of the process rather than on the outside throwing tomatoes and wondering what's going wrong.
Yeah, maybe I can kick us off. So absolutely, I think developing talent and skills and having a pipeline to that is going to be super important for the future digital economy. I'll take the first perspective from the public service. Incentivize. Incentivize, workforce, from a workforce development planning perspective, your public servants to learn new skills and the new digital skills. There are modules right now where in 6 weeks you can become a data analyst, as an example, which from a user experience perspective is going to allow you to gain, time and efficiency into your workday. So within the public service, I think the government needs to rethink the way it actually looks at recruiting and workforce development planning and the future of the public service and how it wants to support Canadians more broadly. Outwardly, I think there's a role for private sector as well to democratize learning of digital skills. So whether it's partnering with academic institutions or partnering with, school boards for education curriculums, and not just from your adult kind of ages, but going down to grade 6 and looking at, well, what kind of skills can we teach young kids? AI is already a big part of our everyday world. Let's not kind of create this big vision of AI. You use the applications, Airbnb and Uber, and you booking your tickets on Air Canada online. That's all AI. So what's kind of the next iteration of innovation of AI that is going to be, coming to the forefront, and the one after that?
Yeah, to the point around skilling for the workforce, we've got a couple of different ways that we do that, including like Google has an AI essentials course, and it's easy, it's a low lift. All of us could go out and do that. And then also AI for educators, right? So how do you help teachers understand how to deliver this in the classroom? What kind of tools are there available for them to make their lives easier? So there's like some simple, very tactical ways, but I actually think this is a great project for AI. When you think about, in the public service, there are barriers. I think that there are maybe it's because I'm a former public servant, but I think, I think there would be an audience within the public service for using these tools and getting really dexterous and fluent with the tools. But we can't ignore the fact that there are barriers. But wouldn't it be great if AI was like the tool that was used to identify those barriers and then find a way through them? So I think that's a really good question that Mark Schaan should have to answer the next time he's here.
I think there's also an organizational digital literacy piece, and I think Sue touched on it in the last panel too. Is we have a digital equity issue and access issue in this country right now, which I don't see us making a whole ton of progress on that. And then the second piece, I would say, it's not like we need to start this from scratch. Like other organizations in this country, financial institutions for one, are creating, are striving to create digital resilience. They have the programs in place. They have, out of necessity, for things like crypto and cybersecurity, AML, and all of those kind of requirements. They're driving some of this, and I think to your point previously, it needs to be incentivized. It also needs to be prioritized.
Yeah. Well, look, as I said, there are lots and lots of opportunities in the public service to do things better. And I was one of the co-authors of the original data strategy and then the update that was put out last year. I think it's a very solid frame in terms of where we move forward. And the first one was kind of conceived and written back in 2017. And in fact, that strategy is now used in many other countries, and many other organizations use that frame. Yeah, I mean, there's no question about it. I was definitely on the frontier, pushing a lot. We moved the whole organization to a cloud-based. Back in 1999, we were putting together the first internet application for the census. And as you know, in this last census, 82% of Canadians filled out the census form online. And, pushing for the Canada School of Public Service to put out literally thousands and thousands of public servants through hundreds of courses on literacy. there's a data science network and pushing to say, let's adopt machine language and machine learning and AI and so on. Now we have literally tens of thousands of public servants right across this country who actually use those tools in hundreds of different projects. So this is an insider's view of where things are moving. So there is momentum, and there's lots and lots of work that's happening. But as I said in the beginning, we have some 19th century problems to deal with. And they're not technology related, frankly. I mean, tell a province to share their health data with the federal government. Like, you think that's a technology issue? Yeah, there's some technologies, but there's largely cultural issues. There's all sorts of, issues that are really go beyond, AI. We have data hoarding going on. We have data swamps that are being created. We have data silos because the laws of this country prevent an institution from sharing the data with another institutions of the same level of government. And so we have lots of challenges, no question. But I will argue, despite those challenges, public servants are in fact moving forward. And I gave you a few examples. I can give you, lots more if you're interested, where we're actually leaders and we're moving forward. So I'm a believer in let's build on the successes. Let's confront the particular issues. And let's have the right strategies to be able to get and move forward. So lots and lots of challenges, but they're not technical. And we have to have a real conversation with civil society. We have to demonstrate that we are users of data, and we are responsible users of their data, and that they have a say, and the diversity of voices have to be built into where it is that we're going.
So let me throw a curveball, and before I do, preview the questions coming after so that everyone's on the same page. I'm going to ask you about the international, and then I'm going to ask you about specific policies that you think the Internet Society of Canada should be focusing on. But before we go there, it strikes me, and this is your point about diverse voices, because I've always felt excluded from pretty much all policy processes here in Ottawa, especially digital ones, because the metaphors just don't work for me. And it strikes me that no one ever really gets to question the metaphors, like data is the new oil, which I always thought was a garbage metaphor, right? Or that AI is going to come alive and be this god, which I think is a garbage metaphor. But there's never room to question these metaphors. So if we're going to have a government thinking about the future, bringing people together for the future, how do we question those metaphors? Who gets to decide those metaphors? Because I would tell you right now that the internet doesn't exist. It's just a metaphor, right? People aren't talking about TCP/IP when they talk about the internet, right? The web, which, yes, that's HTTP, right? That exists, but the internet is just a metaphor. So how do we, within the realm of policy and legislation and, qualitative and quantitative statistics, challenge metaphors and engage in metaphors when it comes to policy? Again, a little digression before we come back to the questions on the agenda. Anyone interested in taking that on?
I'll probably repeat what was already said earlier. Simplifying the language. I think we throw a lot of metaphors out there, and even certain terminology is understood differently between private and public sectors, but just leveling it down a bit, making it understandable for everybody and having that common thread that we can all understand. I think it's the first step, level 0, let's say, to pursuing conversation. That's all.
Any other random thoughts on the use of language in a contemporary society where words mean such different things?
Well, a very smart man recently said, and I'm just going to steal it because imitation is the highest form of flattery. If back in the day, AI had, instead of being coined something as scary as artificial intelligence, had been coined computational statistics, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be, having the types of, inflamed and hyperbolic conversations that we're having. So language does matter. That horse left the barn a long time ago there's a metaphor for you.
Although, as someone who owns horses, they're always trying to get in my barn. Constantly. But,
well, there you go. The metaphor doesn't work then.
And to your point, isn't AI just cloud computing, right? Why are we not calling it cloud computing? But again, stories matter. Now, on the international front, because that was a question in the agenda, you know, are there jurisdictions, are there parts of the world, levels of government that we could be looking to for being forward-thinking, that they have strategies or successes? Shout out to a new friend I made today who's from the Netherlands Embassy, who's part of his work is to come to events like this and champion the cybersecurity and cyber economic issues of the Netherlands. Are there other jurisdictions that Canada should be looking to when it comes to learning about how to close the loop between legislation, technology, and the future?
Sure, maybe I'll start. First of all, any country that says that they figured this out and now we're on easy street or whatever it is and we've got our population behind us and so on is probably fibbing, okay? Even the most authoritarian countries who don't really care about, you know, privacy or human rights or whatever it is, we're just going to collect all that data, we're going to adhere to, or we're going to tease out all the patterns, we're going to tell you what to do and so on. They haven't figured it out yet, okay? And even some countries who sort of figured it out and their governments collected all this data, guess what? They got overturned and overthrown, and now we've got other regimes, and the public is like, oh my God, what have we done? Okay? So even those that were looking at the windshield and those that were looking beyond are wondering, okay, what's the right way to go? Okay? And I would say we're, like most other things, right in the middle in that continuum. You've got those that say this is surveillance capitalism. You know, these big companies have stolen all our data. How dare you legislate and, you know, make it even legal when it was theft in the first place. And then you've got others who are saying, well, okay, it is where it is, but we're going to stop and we're going to make sure that it doesn't get worse. You know, GDPR, EU, and so on. So, and even those like the United States that kind of went a bit too far are now saying, ooh, maybe we need to bring it back a bit, right? So that means that we are perfectly placed in this continuum. And so the question is, how do we move forward collectively, right? You go too fast, you're going to find yourself alone and vulnerable. You're going to see all your regulations and laws kind of going, oh my God, okay, where do we go? You go, you know, if you go too slow and then you see, you know, what happens, you see so I think, you know, there are thoughtful ways in which we need to work together. And I'm a big believer in even if you go a little bit slower, but you work in a collaborative way. And I think the language matters. I think there's a lot of these analogies and metaphors and whatever. That's great. It may sell papers, it may get eyeballs on websites and so on. I think the proof is in the eating. I think most citizens want to see their governments being responsible. They want to deliver good services to them. They want to make sure that their data are protected and that they have a say in where it is that, you know, they want to move forward. So our aim should be in those applications and working with them to demonstrate true value and demonstrate responsible use of their data. And there's work to do. There's work to do in the private sector. They're struggling. There's only a third of the private sector, as for the latest survey that I'd seen, that are actually using these technologies, that have the capabilities. It's only a third or maybe a little better that even have the cybersecurity protections that they need in order to actually move forward. So we can be just as critical, I would say, in other sectors of our society who need that digital literacy and need to understand the responsible use. So I think we have a lot of work to do on multiple fronts. But I think we're, like I said, we're firmly in the middle. I think we're well placed. We just need to accelerate, and we need to start thinking in the digital world rather than applying, you know, the old world views, and move forward in that thoughtful way. I think Canada can actually have an opportunity to do some very responsible things and create a whole line of business and create that expertise and export that expertise, because we do have that infrastructure, that trust. We even have the energy. This is all about energy sources as well. And I think there's that advantage that we can work together with the private and the public sector to create.
Go ahead.
So I think my 5.5, I'll kick it up to 6.5 for 7 now. Because there's one thing that I violently agree with Anil. Canada has the potential to be and do some great things just by looking at what other jurisdictions have gone through and apply what is appropriate for a Canadian context. So I have a few examples that I just want to give, and they're kind of spread out everywhere. But if we're looking at the UK, for example, from the regulatory sandbox perspective, they've created an innovation hub that looks at how do you facilitate that testing, how do you facilitate that collaboration between regulators and industry. And that's taken them fairly a long way, but finally to a point where success, and they're able to look at measuring certain of these objectives. Singapore, from a perspective of digital transformation and being a citizen service-oriented government, I think they've done wonderful things. Of course, the cusp of that is cloud adoption, right? They've accelerated the rate of adoption of cloud in government, but also democratizing that across industries in their economy to be able to level it up. And I will preface also, the United States national AI strategy. They're looking at it from a research and a resource perspective, and how do you inject additional investments to it to foster that kind of development, deployment, and responsible adoption of AI. And the one thing that I will say that Canada has, and I'll end with that, has the opportunity right now to look at the AI legislation. So there's a lot of work that has gone into C27 and ADA, along with the privacy component of the bill. But taking a step back and making sure that it doesn't become a barrier or doesn't stifle innovation, but rather encourages it, I'll probably turn to the Hiroshima AI principles and say that the flexibility of those principles and the way that they are presented is probably something that Canada should look towards. It is use-cased, it is risk-based, and it is outcome objective. And so this is probably something that we need to have a dialogue on the next iteration of what an AI regulatory framework could look like for this country, and tie it to productivity and tie it to competitiveness as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think, I started my career in trade policy, and I drank the Kool-Aid. And it lasts to this day, which is, Canada is a trading nation. We always have been, whether that's in physical goods, in our service economy, and now in the digital economy. We cannot go it alone, and we shouldn't try. It's not to our benefit. And so when you think about, something as incredibly transformative as AI, which is really a breakthrough in how we make breakthroughs. It'll have impacts and opportunity across so many of our sectors. I think, we have to acknowledge where we have this strength in the research side. If we're really going to benefit, we actually have to move that to the commercialization side and the adoption side, so that we can kind of tackle that global stage of getting our companies to be successful in selling to the world. And so in order to achieve that, we have to be very careful that we do not place ourselves on a regulatory island and make it more difficult to build and to deploy here in Canada than elsewhere in the world. I think we have to be very thoughtful about that. And one of the things that I would look at is how's the elephant doing it? We know we're the mouse. What's the elephant doing? Well, the U.S. is pursuing this in a really interesting way, including through an executive order, but one that was done in a really kind of intensely collaborative way to land in a place that could be, where there could be alignment between industry and government on how to approach these big issues, and then taking it right down to NIST, right? And have a hub and spoke model that places the conversations, the technical conversations, closest to the centers of expertise, right? Rather than trying to have a super, agency that's governing all things AI. And so I think that there are some really helpful approaches there that we should be integrating into, not necessarily duplicating, right? And really kind of seizing, not only the momentum, but just like everything that they've built, so that we can take a continental approach or global approach to AI policy, and we actually, while we still have the opportunity to do that.
The last thing I'll add is, and Neil mentioned this as well, you will find a lot of great use cases around the world, and the best ones come from, either sort of like single city government or governments that have a bit more autonomy and do not have to deal with the multiple layers of government or intergovernmental governance that we have in this country. The second thing I would say is we have an aspiration and an ambition, and I think we just need to get behind that. Like if you look at Australia's ambition around being a leader in quantum, they said they're going to be a leader in quantum. They've put a ton of budgeted money in the long term against that aspiration, which includes nationwide education of their team, their ability to commercialize the R&D, import-export regulations. So they have enabled their aspiration. And what I feel like we are doing, we have an aspiration, and now we're playing a bit of whack-a-mole to try and line things up behind, the aspiration in a very kind of safe way, like the recently announced AI Security Council. So I think that we just need to put the aspiration out there and then enable public and private sector to meet the aspiration.
And I'll actually take that as a moment to give a plug for myself in terms of next week I'm going to Middlesex Centre, which is a rural municipality on the other side of London, to help them develop an AI strategy, which they are largely focusing on like ChatGPT and Claude. But I want to show them Google Notebook, because what I love about Google Notebook is it really allows you to configure the quote-unquote chatbot to communicate around documents and resources that you love. And it's fantastic as a playground, as a sandbox, that you can do a lot in terms of the policy development, in terms of the community relations, the community liaison work. So again, I think a lot of this does come down to on the ground, right? Working with these types of municipalities, these types of levels of government to allow them to understand that. I think that's where we turn the corner, as it were, to be proactive instead of reactive. So in our last few minutes, especially because we're kind of ending the day before our reception, which we hope all of you stay for, are there particular policy areas that you think the Canadian Internet Society should be focusing on? And because I'm throwing this on you at the last moment, it wasn't the agenda, I'll go first. I think cybersecurity is the scandal that we have been neglecting and paying lip service to. And, to your points about Canada being a world leader, why are we not ranked up there with North Korea and Iran and Russia when it comes to cybersecurity prowess? I think that's a missed opportunity. Granted, I'm suggesting we should be white hats. But nonetheless, there is a tremendous amount of capability and expertise within the hacking communities here in Canada. It is not at all working closely with government. And I'm saying it should be, because that is a model internationally that we're seeing, and that is a policy area I think we should be prioritizing. I'm being a little facetious, but obviously not at all. Other areas that you think the Internet Society of Canada should be focusing on when it comes to policy priorities?
So I list, and I'll just kind of briefly go through it. Cyber ditto a million times. Copyright Act. Government did do a consultation on it. It went to a black hole, and we never saw the next version of it. AI. What does the AI framework look like under our next government? And energy policy. So I know Anil mentioned it and referenced it, but more specifically, how does that energy policy directly look at the digital infrastructure side of things? Because I can tell you from an AWS perspective, who is very present with this infrastructure in Quebec, we are having one challenging time in a province that has no energy left for any industry, let alone ours. So how do you better integrate that relationship in making sure that the energy policy of Canada is aligned to the infrastructure side and the demand side and the forecasting and et cetera, et cetera. And it all goes back to the success of business in Canada and the public sector as well, which is included.
Right on.
So I agree. I think those are all really important areas to focus on when it comes to policy. But I also think that maybe not every, but it's if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? Not everything has to be a policy solution or a policy conversation. So how are we also thinking about public engagement, because those voices, like, what is they have skin in the game, Canadians do, in us getting this right, in determining the priorities. So how do we engage Canadians in the conversation of the future of digital adoption in this country?
I love that. And I'm going to double down on what I mentioned earlier. I think digital equity and access is going to be critical.
So we're going to have to pick winners, okay? And so if we're going to, have the equivalent of energy, which has really been our, energy, minerals, and so on, which has really been our kind of mark on the world, I think there's a real possibility that data digital can be our next big thing. And so I think we have to focus in the area. I mean, I'm of the world, kind of I know I'm going to make an analogy to the real world to just to kind of show what I'm thinking, is that, we didn't build roads and railroads and said everybody else figure out what the safety looks like and whether they're reliable. I mean, that's something that should come out of the box. Cybersecurity should be part of the infrastructure that is provided to businesses and citizens. It should not be left up to everybody to go hunt and look for whatever they need. Yeah. It is a sad state that, 2/3 of businesses, don't have any kind of, plan or resources or even a point person for cybersecurity, when you see half of them or even more getting hacked and, are subject to ransomware. And so that should be out of the box. It should be something that citizens have. And then we should have those kinds of rules, and that's subject to change as to, how fast, where we go. We should be doubling down on teaching people about data. Data is the actual asset, and how do you govern it? How do you have the kind of skills? How do you, so we should be teaching people, businesses as well. We should be teaching entrepreneurs how it is that they can look at that. That is the actual asset. How do you manage it in this real world, which is global, where those rents come to us rather than, to others in the world, if you know what I mean. We should be the ones that have that expertise, and we should be exporting that expertise, because that is far, far greater in terms of value than just exporting the raw product. So there are many areas that we could focus in on, but we're going to have to, be very strategic. And I think we're the creators in many of these instances of that intelligence. That originated right here in Canada. And we need to get really good at being excellent at it, not just good or good enough, and then saying, how do we make that our advantage on the global front?
But what I find absurd, and perhaps indicative of the problem with the current policy process, is I assume you've never actually been in a debate where someone argued, no, data is not valuable. Data is not what people should be focusing on.
I've heard people say things like alternate facts, and I've heard all
sorts of things.
No, but
I'm not arguing conspiracy, and that was a derogatory attack there, sir. But I ask you, audience members, has your number of your view, your confidence of the future of 0 to 10, has it changed as a result of our discussion? Is there anyone here who would argue that it has indeed changed, whether raised or lowered? Certainly some of us on the panel have had our views raised. And else, yes, a hand in the back. Did it go higher or lower? Lower. Anyone else here whose view of the future has increased in optimism or decreased in optimism? Anyone else want to say that they've changed? Yes, another hand. Higher, yes. So we reached 2 people today. Congratulations, I think, certainly for a policy discussion. That is a major milestone. If we could give a warm round of applause to our panel.
Next time I want the measure of success of the panel to be told in advance that this was going to be a popularity contest.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful panel. You guys were great. We've learned a lot. I'd say we reached more than 2, Jesse. So thanks to all of you for coming tonight. I'm not going to labor on because I'm standing between you all and a drink. So I just want to say that I think today was very, very interesting, productive. We're going to take all of this feedback It's going to be very useful in informing our report, and I hope that you will look out for additional forums, webinars that we will be hosting in order to further delve into the areas that we identified in our initial forum. So thank you again for coming. If you're not a member of the Canadian Internet Society, I would encourage you to join us. Also, we have a policy committee that meets once a month where these types of discussions happen. I invite you to become a member, and if you're interested in joining our policy committee, just email me. Okay, thanks. Oh, and thank you to all of our viewers online.